Welcome to Information Return Intelligence, the fast-moving weekly podcast where we talk about all things related to 1099s and anything else in the information return world. This week, I wanted to talk about dealing with errors and filing corrections. As you listen to this, if you're listening to it live in mid-February, you've hopefully already filed your 1099 NECs. You do have a longer period of time for filing other information forms like the 1099 miscellaneous or 1042S, but you might have filed those by now as well. Let's talk about what do you do if now you discover an error on something that you filed. So first of all, we need to talk about why we file 1099s. We need to understand why we file so you can understand when to file corrections. So you might say, well, we file because the IRS tells us to. And that's kind of true. It's actually not the IRS, it's tax law that tells us that we have to file. But the bottom line is, the government says you have to do it, and that's true. But why does the government tell us we have to? And the answer to that is tax compliance. So when you file a 1099 with the IRS, that goes into the IRS computers under if it's an individual, the last name and the taxpayer identification number of the recipient. So usually it's the last name and the social security number, or the business name and the EIN. Because ultimately, that whatever you're reporting on that 1099, that dollar amount is taxable income to the recipient of that form. So the IRS logs your 1099 in its system under that person's, the recipient's, name and taxpayer ID number. And then their computers are watching the tax returns of the recipient of your 1099 to make sure that they're honestly reporting their income. That's why we file 1099s. In a future episode, we'll talk more about how the IRS computers use the information that you send them. They key to the first four letters of the last name plus the taxpayer ID number. That's all we're going to say for today, but keep that in mind, the last name and the taxpayer ID number, because that brings us to penalties. So the IRS can assess penalties for late filing of 1099s, and that could be as simple as you simply missed the deadline. The deadline has passed, you discover that you need to send someone a 1099, so you file it, and it's after the deadline. There's a second thing, though, and that is that the law requires you to file a complete and accurate form by the deadline. So if you file a form with errors on it, you could be penalized by the IRS for failure to file because you didn't file a complete and accurate form. And this is why we file corrections. There's a key date coming up. We're a long ways away from it yet, but there's a key date coming up where if you submit your corrections by that date, you won't be penalized. Now let's talk a little more about penalties because this ties into corrections. You're only penalized for errors that cause the IRS computers to have problems with doing their job. Remember, they look at the last name and the social security number, and then whatever you put for the dollar amount. If there are errors with those things, then that hinders the ability of the IRS computers to do their job. So therefore, the IRS can penalize you for things like errors with a last name, errors with dollar amounts, and errors with taxpayer identification numbers. Notice what's not on that list. First names and addresses. The IRS doesn't use first names or addresses in their computer matching. And so you're not hurting their computers if you make an error with a first name or an address. Obviously, you should correct those things in your files so that future filings are done correctly, but you're not penalized. And therefore, you don't have to file a correction with the IRS to fix a first name or an address. There's also the concept of what's called de minimis dollar amount errors. A de minimis dollar amount error is an error that is $100 or less for all boxes except backup withholding. Backup withholding, it's $25 or less. So, for example, you pay $3,000 to a contractor and need to send a 1099 NEC to this contractor. And you make a typo when you're typing this information in, and you put 3003 instead of 3000. That's a $3 error, which is way less than 100. Therefore, you're not required to file a correction to fix that, and there is no penalty. Now, at some point in the future, we'll go deeper into this too, where if your contractor says, hey, I want a corrected form, and they follow the proper procedure for requesting one, then you do have to file a correction. But generally, the IRS isn't going to do anything to you if there's a small dollar amount error. So back to corrections now as we put all of these puzzle pieces together. You need to fix errors with last names or business names, taxpayer identification numbers, dollar amounts that are not de minimis, or other types of errors like maybe you put something in the wrong box or you used the wrong form. Those things all need to be corrected. And if you correct by August 1st, and the number of forms that you're correcting for most average companies and organizations, if the number of forms you're correcting is 10 or less, you're not penalized at all. So if you discover one or two 1099s that you filed that have errors on them, go ahead and fix them. As long as you fix by August 1st, you won't be penalized. So that's why you file corrections. Do so by August 1st, and you won't be penalized for filing a form with an error on it. So if you made a mistake on a form, correct it. Submit that corrected filing by August 1st. You won't be penalized unless you're filing a lot of corrections. Then you could be penalized on the corrections that are over 10. But most of the time, you're not going to be penalized. So that'll do it for this week's episode of Information Return Intelligence. I'm Jason Dynison. Thanks for listening, and join us again next week.